The flames danced in the reflection of my sunglasses as I stood quietly, arms folded, watching what was left of my tractor hiss and pop in the charred grass. Karen stood 10 feet away, still shrieking at the firemen like they were her personal cleanup crew. Her face was red, her hair frizzed by heat, her voice cracking from overuse. She yelled something about how I should have known better than to park farm equipment in a residential neighborhood, that it was an eyesore, that it ruined the aesthetic of the block. And as if her words weren't already ridiculous enough, she added a cherry on top. She screamed, "It was your fault for bringing fire into the neighborhood." What she didn't know was that the man she was accusing happened to be the one who teaches local law enforcement how to identify arson. And what she also didn't know is that the fire she just lit told me everything I needed to know. Fires have voices, and this one was already singing. It started 3 days earlier when a pastel-colored envelope showed up in my mailbox with a shiny HOA seal that looked like it had been printed using leftover wedding invitations. Inside was a letter that started with the words, "Dear Resident," which immediately made me roll my eyes. It accused me of multiple violations, including visual pollution due to storage of industrial machinery. By industrial machinery, they meant my tractor, the one I'd parked on my own land, on the same family ranch my grandfather built with his bare hands back in the 30s. Apparently, my tractor was now causing community distress, according to Karen anyway. I had just poured myself some coffee and was halfway through buttering toast when I heard the knock. No one in the country knocks that fast unless they're selling something or trying to start a fight. I opened the door, and there she was, Karen, mid-50s, blonde highlights, holding a clipboard like it was a weapon. She didn't wait for an invitation. She stepped forward, her eyes already scanning my porch for violations. She told me she was the acting president of the Rolling Pines HOA and that they had received multiple complaints about my property. I asked her what property she was referring to because, as far as I knew, my place wasn't under any HOA. She smiled that tight customer service but murderous smile and said a new map had been drawn up last year, and apparently my land was now inside the outer border of the HOA district. I asked her if the map had been blessed by the Lord himself because last I checked, county lines didn't move just because someone bought a laminator. She handed me a fine slip, $1,000 due within 5 days, or legal action would follow. I asked her what law allowed her to fine me on land the county had zoned for agriculture. She started rattling off a list of bylaws like she was reading a Bible verse. I cut her off and told her, kindly but firmly, to get off my porch. She narrowed her eyes and said this wasn't over. I said it was for today. She spun on her heel and marched back down the path like she expected the gravel to salute her. Later that evening, I parked my tractor a little closer to the barn and walked the perimeter like I always did before sunset. Everything looked fine, peaceful. Ember, my old hound, was snoozing by the porch. I went in, made dinner, watched the news, and went to bed. I didn't hear anything suspicious, but that's how arson works. It doesn't kick down the door. It waits for the silence. The next morning at dawn, I woke to Ember howling. The smell hit me before my boots hit the floor. Acrid, sweet, wrong. I ran outside, and there it was, fire crawling over the tractor like it was hungry, flames shooting high enough to make the barn groan. I grabbed the hose. Nothing. Water line had been cut. I grabbed the fire extinguisher from the shed and emptied it, but the fire was laughing at me by then. The neighbors were calling it in, phones glowing in the early light. Someone shouted. Someone else ran over with a shovel. I waved them off. There was nothing to be done at that point. It was gone. The fire crew arrived 12 minutes later. They worked quickly, efficiently, but the damage was already done. The tractor was totaled, metal twisted, tires melted to puddles. My barn had smoke damage. Ember sat beside me the whole time, ears back, quiet as stone. And then Karen showed up in flip-flops, carrying a smoothie. She started yelling at the firemen about how unsafe it was to keep farm equipment around homes, how I had ignored repeated warnings, how I brought this on myself. I stayed silent. I didn't say a word. I just watched the way her eyes scanned the wreckage without surprise, the way she kept her distance, the way her hands stayed clenched around that cup like it was anchoring her story. Once the fire was under control and the last hose was rolled up, I walked the edge of the burn zone quietly. There were burn patterns I recognized immediately. A distinct V-shaped origin near the rear tire, char patterns along the grass line, a residue on the gravel that told me this wasn't an electrical fault or a spontaneous engine spark. This was set purposefully, sloppily, like someone read a WikiHow on fire starting and skipped the safety warnings. And worst of all, they had done it with no idea what they were leaving behind. I crouched near the melted tire, using a pen to shift the ash. There it was, a melted plastic grain, the bottom of a gas can, still bearing the faint red streak of Ranch Pro Fuel containers. I didn't touch it. I didn't move it. I just stared, because at that moment, I knew two things for certain. One, this was arson. Two, the person who did it had no idea they had picked the worst possible victim. I didn't call the sheriff yet. I didn't alert the insurance company. I didn't even post about it on the local community page. No, I did what I've always done when faced with fire. I studied it. I listened. And I let the evidence tell the story. This wasn't about revenge, not yet. This was about gathering the truth, one scorched breadcrumb at a time. And when it was time, I'd make sure Karen's name wasn't just on a clipboard. It would be on a report. A report that would lead straight to court or, better yet, county jail. Because unlike Karen, I knew the rules, and I played by them until the last card was face up. The morning after the fire, I stood in my kitchen with a notepad and a thermos of coffee, staring out the window at what was left of the tractor. The fire hadn't spread to the barn, but smoke still clung to the wooden siding like a bruise. I wasn't angry, not yet. What I felt was something quieter, colder, more precise. It was the same thing I felt when I was called out to investigate house fires that left nothing but ashes and a grieving family standing in pajamas on the sidewalk. It was the feeling that came before the work, and this time the work was mine. I started by walking the perimeter again in daylight. The burn path was short and focused, not accidental. A spontaneous combustion or mechanical short would have scattered its pattern or flared from an engine. This one started low at the tire and followed the rubber trail like a fuse. I found a melted cap from a plastic jug behind a tree about 12 feet from the ignition point, not tossed far enough to be a panic throw, but not close enough to be seen by a casual glance. There were boot prints too, smaller than mine, with an angled tread. Not work boots. Tennis shoes. A woman's size. Maybe Karen's size. I took photos of everything with my phone, labeling each in a notebook. I boxed off the cap with a shovel and scooped it into a metal tray, then locked it in my garage fridge until I could take it to the lab. I wasn't about to file an official report yet. I knew how this town worked. Small cases got shuffled. Big cases got political. But a quiet investigation done right, that got results, especially when you had no intention of letting it fade into paperwork. I drove into town just before noon and stopped by the co-op supply store. It's the only place within 20 miles that sells Ranch Pro Fuel jugs in those red plastic containers. I know because I've bought plenty over the years. I nodded to Jacob, the kid at the counter, and asked if they had any security footage from the last few days. Told him I had a feeling someone had been casing my property. That wasn't a lie, technically. Jacob was happy to help. He pulled up the footage on the old monitor behind the counter. We fast-forwarded through the late-night customers, the usual ranchers, the high schoolers buying chips. And then I saw her, Karen, 2 nights before the fire, hair tucked under a wide-brimmed sun hat, sunglasses, a scarf covering her neck even though it was 70 degrees outside. She walked in with purpose, didn't speak to anyone, grabbed gloves, long matches, and a 2-gallon Ranch Pro jug. Paid cash. Didn't say a word. It wasn't illegal, but it was suspicious as hell, especially for someone who lived 2 streets over and had no animals, no garden, and no business buying fuel containers. I asked Jacob to print a time-stamped receipt and still image from the footage. He handed them over without question. I thanked him, walked out, and sat in my truck for a while. The puzzle was coming together faster than I expected, which meant it was time to be careful. People like Karen don't get away with things because they're smart. They get away because no one wants the drama. but I wasn't afraid of drama. I just wanted it recorded. Back at the ranch, I went through my neighbor's footage next. Old Man Fisher has a ring cam on the side of his house that catches the gravel road running behind both our properties. He's the type that re-watches the footage for entertainment. I brought him a 6-pack of root beer and a fresh bag of peanuts. In exchange, I got access to everything he'd recorded the night of the fire. There it was, at 1:42 a.m. A silver crossover crept down the back lane with its lights off. It stopped just past the edge of my property. A figure stepped out. Female, hoodie, gloves. She moved with hesitation, looking around, then pulled something from the back seat. A few minutes later, light flared. First a flicker, then a bloom of orange. She ran back to the car, slammed the door, and sped off. I paused the footage at the license plate. It was fuzzy. Fisher's camera had a limited range, but I knew the model. It was Karen's Ford Escape. Same dent in the bumper. Same faded HOA sticker on the back window. I didn't need the plate. I had the footage, the timestamp, the receipts, and soon I'd have residue evidence from the plastic cap. It wasn't enough for an arrest yet, but it was enough for me. The next day, I visited the local vet office where Ember used to be a working dog before she retired to a life of porch naps and belly rubs. She was part of the county's arson unit, trained to detect accelerants better than any lab. I made a quiet call, borrowed her old vest, and took her back to the burn site just after dawn. She sniffed around with her usual lazy pace, tail wagging, then froze at the base of the tire. She sat alert, then moved to the tree line, sat again, then sniffed the trail leading toward the trash bins across the street. Another sit. That was 3 alerts, classic accelerant trail. Even without lab confirmation, Ember's reactions were enough to justify a formal report. Dogs don't lie. Not about fire. That afternoon, I boxed up the gloves and plastic cap and drove them to my old lab contact in the city. I told him I needed it quiet and fast. He owed me a favor from a barn fire I solved 5 years back that saved his uncle's insurance claim. He agreed, said I'd have results in 48 hours. I thanked him and drove back home, my thoughts already turning toward the next step. That night, Karen held a neighborhood barbecue, a celebration. She called it for community progress. I showed up with a store-bought potato salad and stayed quiet. She gave a speech on keeping the neighborhood clean and safe, thanked everyone for helping improve property values, smiled as if she hadn't committed a felony 3 nights earlier. She caught my eye once and gave me that same smug smile she wore on my porch. I smiled back, nodded, told her the fire crew said it looked suspicious. Her smile faltered for half a second, not long, but enough. Then she changed the subject. I walked home after dark, Ember trotting beside me. The evidence was lining up. The story was writing itself, and Karen didn't even realize the case was already open. I wasn't going to fight her in public. I wasn't going to yell or post angry rants online. I was going to do what I always did, build the case, follow the flame, and let the truth handle the rest. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that wraps around your bones and makes every creak in the walls feel like a signal. I sat in the living room with the lights off, sipping lukewarm coffee. Ember curled up at my feet. Outside, the old backup tractor sat under a pale moon, looking helpless and forgotten. But every inch of it was being watched. 3 motion-activated cameras, 1 GPS-tagged fuel can, a UV dye trap under the rear step, and a hidden microphone embedded inside an old birdhouse on a nearby tree. I had set the stage like a man preparing for a school play. Only the lead actor didn't know she had a role yet. The next morning began with a knock on my door that was too polite to be a stranger and too sharp to be friendly. I opened it to find the sheriff standing on my porch, hat in one hand, a folder in the other. He was an old friend from my Army days, a man named Curtis Hill. We'd served in the same unit back when our backs were straighter and our hair was thicker. He didn't smile, just gave me a slow nod and said he figured it was time we talked. I stepped aside and let him in without a word. Ember, who usually greeted guests with wagging enthusiasm, just stared at him, alert but silent. She knew the weight in the air, too. We sat at the kitchen table while he flipped open the folder. Inside were printed stills of Karen at the co-op, timestamps from the security footage, and a short report I had written detailing the physical evidence I'd collected. Curtis scanned the paper slowly, pausing every now and then to trace a detail with his finger. When he finished, he closed the folder and leaned back in the chair, tapping the edge of the table with one thick finger. He said it was a hell of a case, solid, professional, but he asked why I hadn't handed it over sooner. I told him I wanted it airtight, that I knew how this county worked and how fast things got buried when politics got involved. I said Karen had too many connections to risk filing a complaint without overwhelming evidence. Curtis didn't argue. He just nodded again and said he would file it under special review. That meant limited access and no internal leak. He told me to be careful, that people like Karen didn't go down easy. They dragged others with them. After he left, I sat on the porch with Ember and let the wind pass over us like a slow wave. I knew Curtis was right. Karen wasn't finished. She was the kind of person who believed rules were for everyone else, that consequences were for the weak. She'd been unchecked for too long, drunk on the power of neighborhood control, and now that someone had pushed back, she was going to dig in. I wasn't afraid, but I knew I needed to stay one step ahead. That afternoon, I headed into town to check the courthouse records. I wanted to see just how deep her reach was. What I found surprised even me. Over the last year, Karen had issued over 75 fines to various residents for everything from mailbox colors to grass height violations. Most of the payments had been routed through a digital wallet under her name, not the HOA account. Several of the residents listed didn't even live within the HOA boundaries. It was a scam, plain and simple. But she had cloaked it under layers of legal-sounding jargon and fear tactics. I made copies of the records and stored them in a fireproof box in my truck. I wasn't just building a case anymore. I was building a shield. The more truth I had in my corner, the less she could twist when the time came. On the way home, I stopped at the farm supply store again. The clerk handed me a printout from the day Karen made her suspicious purchase. Along with it, he handed me a receipt from a second purchase made an hour later. Same gloves, same fuel brand, same matchbox, different name. Signed under a young man named Tommy Brock, Karen's nephew, 18 years old and already tangled in her mess. I drove out to the Brock residence just before sunset. Their trailer sat on the edge of town near a dry creek bed and a patch of sun-bleached lawn chairs. Tommy answered the door with a smirk that vanished the second he saw who I was. I told him I wasn't there to threaten him, that I just wanted to know why he bought those items. He stammered, eyes darting, and finally admitted Karen had asked him to pick them up, said it was for a home project, that she'd given him cash and told him not to talk about it. I asked if he knew what she'd done with it. He shook his head, said he didn't ask questions. I believed him, but I also warned him that silence could make him part of the crime, that the fire had put lives at risk, that if he had anything more to share, now was the time. He said nothing more, just nodded and stepped back inside. Back at the ranch, I reviewed all the footage again, every angle, every second. I sensed timestamps between the co-op cameras, the neighbor's ring cam, and my own hidden lenses. Together, they formed a complete timeline. Karen had driven to the store, instructed her nephew to make a duplicate purchase, and returned to my property under cover of darkness. Her car was captured twice, her outline clear. The gas cans glow from the UV dye I'd rigged lit up like a beacon. It was enough to indict. That night, I set up another trap. I left out a decoy file folder on my porch marked Private Fire Case EVIDENC. Inside were blank sheets and a GPS tag no larger than a coin. I placed Ember on watch and went to bed early, the windows cracked to listen for movement. Just after 2:00 a.m., I heard the creak of the gate. I sat up, heart steady, and watched the tablet linked to my outdoor cameras. A figure in a hoodie approached, crouched low. They picked up the folder and turned it over. Then they bolted. I followed the tracker from my phone, watching it pain as it moved down the road, then disappeared into a backyard near the HOA office shed. In the morning, Curtis and I retrieved the folder from a trash can behind the building. Inside were coffee grounds and a torn wrapper from a protein bar. We pulled surveillance from the HOA office. Sure enough, it showed Karen's niece unlocking the shed door just after the folder was dropped. It was sloppy, desperate, and it connected the dots even tighter. By noon, Curtis filed an official warrant. Karen was to be brought in for questioning, not just for arson now, but for obstruction and misuse of HOA authority. Her carefully constructed tower of control was collapsing, one board at a time, and all I had to do was keep hammering in the nails. As I stood by the fence that evening, hammer in one hand, ember beside me, I watched the sun dip behind the ridge. The light cast long shadows across the scorched patch where my old tractor once sat, but the shadows didn't look like loss anymore. They looked like proof, like the outline of something broken that was finally being rebuilt the right way, slowly, carefully, and with full knowledge that this time it would last. The morning after Karen's arrest, the neighborhood was buzzing like a kicked beehive. People who had never so much as nodded my way were now waving from their porches or stopping their cars to ask if I was okay. It was surreal. 1 week earlier, I was the grumpy tractor guy at the edge of the HOA map. Now I was the man who took down the queen bee. I didn't care about the attention. What I cared about was the silence, the peace that had returned to my mornings. But peace never lasts long when pride is still smoldering, and Karen's pride was an open flame waiting for fuel. Later that afternoon, I received a call from Deputy Hill. His tone was low, measured, the kind he used when something didn't sit right. He told me someone had broken into the evidence locker where my case files were stored. Nothing had been taken, but the bin labeled Karen D. Arson case had clearly been opened and rifled through. The only reason the footage and documents weren't stolen was because Hill had already made backup copies and locked them in his office. The cameras at the station weren't working that night either. Coincidence, maybe? Or maybe someone on the inside had been pressured. It didn't take long to figure out who. Karen had a cousin in city council, the kind who talked big and acted small. He had tried to have her released on house arrest, claiming it was a misunderstanding between neighbors. He also filed a complaint against me, saying I had orchestrated an unlawful stain without authority. What he didn't know was that the sheriff had already signed off on everything. Every camera, every trap, every second of footage. My report was airtight, but now it was clear. Karen wasn't going to roll over. She was going to fight this the same way she ruled the HOA, with manipulation, threats, and a desperate smile. That evening, I noticed something strange, a familiar pickup truck idling 2 houses down. Same one that delivered fence panels to Karen's yard last month. I watched it from the porch. It didn't move for 10 minutes. Then it rolled away, slow and quiet. I took note of the plates. I wasn't paranoid. I was methodical. In arson investigations, the second attack is always more reckless than the first. Fear replaces strategy. Desperation burns faster than gasoline. I decided it was time to escalate, not out of anger, but out of necessity. I called in a favor from an old friend at the state fire marshal's office. I asked him to audit Karen's HOA leadership, specifically the finances, where the fines went, how much she collected, whether any records had been forged. He agreed and said he'd make a discreet start. In the meantime, I had another idea. I couldn't prove who had tried to tamper with the evidence locker, but I could lure them out. That night, I parked the decoy tractor back in its original spot and hung a large cardboard sign on it that read Evitience Reviuendain. Then I made sure the cameras were rolling. This time, I added a pressure sensor to the seat. Anyone who tried to tamper with it would trigger a silent alert sent to my phone. Ember and I stayed up late again, waiting. Midnight came and went. 1:30, 2 o'clock. Nothing. Then, at 3:15, the alert buzzed. I checked the tablet. A figure in a hoodie approached the tractor. They reached for the sign, tried to tear it down, then climbed onto the seat. The moment they did, the floodlights activated, and I stepped out from behind the barn with a flashlight. The figure froze, turned, and ran, but not fast enough. I saw the shoes first, bright pink Skechers, same as the pair Karen's niece wore at the last HOA meeting. She had laughed at my old boots and said tractors belonged in museums. I watched her sprint down the road and vanish into the dark. I didn't chase her. I didn't need to. I had the footage. I had her on camera, tampering with a site marked as active evidence. That was enough. The next morning, I handed it all to Deputy Hill. He shook his head, muttered something about family loyalty gone sideways, and promised to escalate it with the DA. Meanwhile, the fire marshal called back. He found something. A discrepancy in the HOA budget. Thousands collected and fines were never deposited. No trace of them in the HOA bank statement. But they did show up in Karen's personal Venmo. She had been charging residents for made-up violations and pocketing the money, landscaping complaints, fence height rules, even charging kids $50 for sidewalk chalk drawings labeled as property defacement. The HOA board had been asleep at the wheel, and she had driven the whole thing straight into fraud territory. Within 48 hours, the HOA board called an emergency vote to dissolve Karen's presidency entirely. They issued a formal letter apologizing to the neighborhood and promising a full refund review for anyone who had paid arbitrary fines. Karen's cousin went silent. Her niece deleted all her social media. And as for the HOA, the board agreed to strip most of its enforcement powers until it could be restructured with actual legal oversight. I spent that afternoon building a new fence post where the old one had burned. As I hammered in the last nail, a few neighbors wandered over. One handed me lemonade. Another offered help with repairs. A kid brought over a drawing of Ember in a fire hat. For the first time in years, I felt something shift, not just around me, within me. A sense that maybe justice still had weight in this world, that even in a small, dusty county where tractors outnumber traffic lights, the truth still mattered. Later that night, I sat by the fire pit in the backyard. Ember curled up beside me, watching the embers glow. The wind was soft, and the stars were bright. The air smelled of ash and pine and something cleaner underneath. It had been a long week, a hard one, but it was worth every sleepless night, every step through burned grass, every second of restraint when I wanted to act faster. Because fire teaches patience. It demands it, and sometimes the slow burn is the one that clears the path. As I leaned back in my chair and took a sip from my mug, I realized the flame that had destroyed my tractor didn't ruin me. It revealed everything that needed to be seen. And once the fire had spoken, there was no turning back. The truth had already caught fire, and there was no one left to put it out. The courthouse was quiet the morning of Karen's arraignment. A gray drizzle hung in the air like the whole town was holding its breath. I didn't plan to attend, but when Deputy Hill called and said the press might show up, I figured I'd better make sure the story stayed straight. I parked a few blocks away, walked through the square with Ember trotting calmly beside me, and took a seat on the wooden bench near the back of the courtroom. Karen entered, flanked by two public defenders, her hair tied in a tight bun, her eyes hollow but still scanning the room like she was the one in control. She wore a navy blue blazer and a stiff expression, the kind that tried to appear dignified but looked more like someone holding in a scream. When the judge asked how she pleaded, her voice cracked just slightly as she answered, "Not guilty." Her lawyer tried to argue that the incident was the result of psychological strain caused by community stress and hormonal imbalance. The courtroom rustled with stifled laughter. The judge was not amused. He asked for clarification on the charges, which included attempted arson, trespassing, falsifying HOA documentation, misappropriation of community funds, and evidence tampering through an accomplice. Karen's face flushed deeper with every word. She reached for a glass of water but knocked it over. Her hands were shaking. I watched her closely, not with anger but with a steady calm that came from knowing the truth had finally settled, like ash after a long fire. After the arraignment, I stepped out into the damp morning and found a few neighbors gathered under umbrellas near the courthouse steps. One of them, a man who had once signed Karen's petition against me, walked up slowly and extended his hand. He apologized, said he had been wrong, said he had believed her lies because it was easier than standing against her. I nodded and accepted it, not because I needed his apology, but because holding grudges wastes more energy than rebuilding fences. Over the next few days, the town shifted, not with noise, but with movement. Quiet gestures. Lawns once trimmed out of fear grew a little freer. Sidewalk chalk returned. Mailboxes repainted without needing permission. One by one, residents started taking back the autonomy Karen had squeezed out of them. And while the HOA board scrambled to rewrite its own authority, I focused on finishing what I'd started. I repainted the barn doors, replanted the singed grass near the tractor site, replaced the back fence panel with reclaimed oak slats I had saved for years. Every nail I hammered in felt like punctuation on a sentence I hadn't known I was writing. Not a declaration of revenge, just a full stop. A period at the end of a long, smoky sentence. Ember and I started taking longer walks around the boundary lines of the ranch, checking fence posts, and making sure everything was still where it should be. On one of those walks, I noticed a letter tucked into the gate, folded, handwritten, no envelope. I opened it slowly, my hands instinctively ready for sarcasm or threat, but it wasn't either. It was a letter from Karen's husband. Short, honest. He said he had no idea what she had become, that he'd have believed she was just trying to help the community, that he had watched her lose herself to control, to status, to pride. He said he was filing for separation, that she had refused help more times than he could count, and that he hoped one day people would remember her for who she was before the HOA consumed her. I folded the letter and didn't respond. Some endings didn't need my signature. By the end of the week, the sheriff's office invited me to give a talk at the local high school about fire safety and property rights. I hadn't stood in front of a classroom since my Army days, but I agreed. The students listened more than I expected, especially when I told them about how even a small fire set by arrogance or pettiness can ignite a whole community. I kept the details simple. No need to name names. But I told them that justice doesn't always arrive in a siren. Sometimes it walks quiet, careful, patient. And sometimes it has a hound dog by its side who knows the scent of gasoline from a mile away. A few days later, I found a surprise waiting at the end of my driveway. A brand new red tractor parked under a canvas tarp with a big ribbon tied around the steering wheel. No note, but I didn't need one. The neighbors had done it, chipped in, donated, replaced what was lost without asking. I didn't cry, but my hand lingered on the seat a little longer than usual before I started it up. The engine purred like a promise. Ember barked once, wagged her tail, and jumped in the passenger footwell like she knew we had work to do again. I used that new tractor to mow the field the next morning, slower than usual, savoring the way the fresh-cut grass mixed with the hum of peace. No sirens, no screaming, no clipboard-toting tyrants, just the sun rising over the hills and the sound of something being built instead of burned. That afternoon, I hosted a small gathering at the barn. Nothing formal, just coffee, lemonade, and a few chairs pulled out for anyone who wanted to sit. Some folks brought pies. Others brought tools. One guy brought his guitar. We didn't talk about Karen. We didn't need to. Instead, we talked about fences, about planting seasons, about dogs and tractors, and how sometimes justice looks like a new sign on a gate that says welcome instead of warning. As the evening settled in, I stood near the fire pit with a mug of black coffee, watching the last streaks of light fade across the field. Ember lay beside me, tired but content. A few kids ran through the pasture, chasing fireflies, their laughter rolling like soft thunder across the hills. I closed my eyes and took it all in. That fire could have broken me, could have cost me more than machinery, but it didn't because I didn't meet it with rage. I met it with discipline, with memory, with patience forged by years of watching sparks turn to blazes and learning when to step back and let the fire tell the truth. Karen thought she could burn down a symbol and scare the man behind it, but all she did was light the path that led her straight to justice. When the last of the neighbors had gone and the fire pit was just glowing embers, I whispered to Ember that maybe next week we finally start building that back porch we talked about. She gave me a sleepy grunt and laid her head down on my boot. I smiled and looked out at the land. The fences were strong. The field was cut, and the night was quiet again. A few weeks passed like a breeze through tall grass, the kind of quiet that settles after a long storm when everything feels heavier but somehow clearer. I had returned to my routines. Early mornings with coffee on the porch, Long walks around the property with Ember, checking fence lines and making sure the pastures were holding steady. There was still a faint scorch mark in the soil where the old tractor burned, but even that had started to fade. Nature was healing the ground faster than I could, and in a way, it was doing the same for me. One morning, as I stepped out to load feed into the new storage bins, I noticed a letter tucked into the latch of the front gate. Again, no envelope, just folded, same as before. For a second, I considered tossing it, but something told me to read it. The handwriting was different, neater. I unfolded it slowly and stood in place as the words settled over me. It was from Karen, not typed, not formal, just raw and strange and scribbled like someone had written it in the middle of the night. She said she had been wrong, that everything she'd done came from a place of fear of losing control, of not mattering, of watching the neighborhood change without her permission. She wrote that she saw people's lives as blueprints, as things that needed to be straightened, fixed, and filed. And she admitted, in her own cold way, that she had set the fire, that when she saw my tractor, it represented everything she didn't understand. Independence, strength, a kind of quiet power that didn't ask for approval. She said she invited, and that envy turned into something meaner. She ended the note with a single sentence that stuck with me more than all the rest. I tried to burn down what I could never build. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. There was no return address, no request for forgiveness, just the hollow sound of someone finally hearing themselves echo back. I tucked the note in a drawer beneath old receipts and seed catalogs, not because I wanted to keep it, but because throwing it away felt too easy. It was a piece of the story, and stories deserve to be remembered, even the ugly parts. Later that day, I drove into town to visit the firehouse. They were hosting a small appreciation ceremony for local investigators. I hadn't worn a badge in over a year, not since I stepped back from full-time duty, but they asked me to say a few words. I stood behind the podium with Ember lying at my feet and spoke plainly. I talked about how fire doesn't just destroy, it reveals. It strips away the polished surface of things and leaves behind what was real all along. Sometimes what's left is tragic. Other times, it's the start of something new. I look at the young recruits in the front row, bright-eyed and ready to run toward danger, and told them that the job wasn't about catching criminals. It was about catching truth. After the ceremony, one of the cadets asked me what the hardest part of my job had been. I thought about it for a moment and answered that it wasn't the fires or even the loss. It was the waiting for people to do the right thing, waiting for justice to work, waiting for the smoke to clear. But when it finally does, I added, you learn to see what matters, what's worth protecting. And that's when the job becomes something bigger than evidence and reports. On my way home, I took the long route past the Southern Ridge, a place I rarely visited since it bordered the land Karen once tried to claim as part of the HOA. The signs had all been taken down now, the ridiculous ones about grass height and fence colors. In their place was a new hand-painted sign made by one of the neighbors. It read, "Welcome to Rolling Pines Ranchland. Respect the land, respect the people." That was enough for me. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed something new. A row of small sunflowers blooming near the spot where the old tractor had stood. I hadn't planted them. Someone else had. Maybe a neighbor, maybe one of the kids from the Firefly chase. They stood tall and quiet, like sentinels guarding the memory of what had happened there. I stood beside them for a long time, listening to the breeze move through their stems, thinking about how even after something's been burned, something else can grow. The next morning, I started building the back porch. Nothing fancy, just a wide wooden deck where I could sit with Ember and watch the horizon without interruption. Each board I laid down felt like setting the foundation for something that would last beyond the noise, beyond the fines, beyond the fires. Something simple and strong. By late afternoon, the last board was in place. I stood back, brushed sawdust from my jeans, and let the moment settle. Ember jumped up and claimed her corner like she'd been waiting her whole life for it. I laughed quietly and sat beside her. The sun dipped low, casting gold across the hills, and the sky opened in streaks of orange and violet. A few birds landed on the fence, chirping like they were giving their approval. As I sat there, I realized something. Karen's fire didn't just spark a case, it sparked a shift. In me, in the neighborhood, maybe even in her. She thought she was destroying a symbol of defiance, but what she really did was prove that you can't control what you don't understand, that real strength doesn't shout, it stands firm, and that sometimes the slowest kind of justice is the most permanent. I reached down and scratched Ember behind the ears. She closed her eyes, content. The ranch was quiet again. The fences were sturdy. The sky above us wide and waiting. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about what had burned. I was thinking about what had survived.